616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 20.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, my amendment stops the Securities and Exchange Commission from pursuing an agenda on climate change and keeps its focus instead on its core mission of protecting investors. In recent years, we've seen the Madoff and Stanford Ponzi schemes built people out of over $70 billion. Many of these victims live in our districts. They are shocked and they're outraged that such a travesty could happen. One would think that after such embarrassments, the SEC would do whatever it could to focus its finite resources on stopping the next Ponzi scheme. At the very minimum, it would make sense for the SEC to appear to get serious in safeguarding the public from fraud and corruption. However, early in 2010, the SEC issued an interpretive guidance for companies to disclose the impact of global climate change might have on their businesses. The SEC published this controversial guidance over the objections of dissenting commissioners. This was done without direction from Congress and outside the traditional rulemaking process. There are no laws in the United States explicitly addressing climate change. The guidance is inappropriate considering the SEC has bigger priorities. I don't have to tell my colleagues that climate change is a controversial and an unresolved issue. From a securities perspective especially, climate change information on a disclosure is highly speculative and dubious at best. If allowed to proceed, it invites all kinds of compliance costs and confusion down the road, and guess who will ultimately pay all those costs? Our constituents, the American public. Importantly, my amendment does not stop companies from mentioning bona fide weather and environmental risk and disclosures. And if a company really wants to weigh in climate change for some reason, they're free to volunteer that information. It just keeps the SEC focused on what they're supposed to be doing, and that is protecting people, not forcing unrelated agendas down their throats. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, federal securities law requires financial disclosures by public companies for the benefit of shareholders and investors. The Securities Exchange Commission provides detailed guidance on how to interpret and comply with these disclosure requirements, which are intended to ensure that potential investors fully understand a security before they purchase it. The SEC recently provided guidance on existing rules that require companies to disclose the impact that business or legal developments related to climate change could have on a company's bottom line. We want investors to know about this. These disclosures help investors understand how climate change affects a company's operations and their potential investments in the company. This amendment seeks to prevent this guidance from taking place. It seeks to keep investors in the dark. Rules discussed in the SEC's guidance are clearly needed, and the SEC's guidance will help publicly traded companies understand how key areas of climate change, such as new legislation or international accords, could affect what they need to disclose to the public. This guidance is also intended to help companies explain how the physical impacts of climate change could affect their performance. In issuing this guidance, the SEC did not opine on the science of climate change. The guidance seeks to help companies assess the possibility that events related to climate change may materially affect their bottom lines and trigger public disclosure requirements. This guidance is prudent and serves to benefit both the investor and the company. Ironically, with this amendment, my friends on the other side of the aisle who proclaim the value of transparency are acting to hurt investors by denying them important information. This amendment would also harm Wall Street by preventing the SEC from issuing clear guidance to help publicly traded firms understand what they need to disclose on this topic to ensure full compliance with the law. It provides some certainty. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman's points about disclosure are on point. They simply don't apply to what this amendment does. It does not deny required disclosure of risk. Let me be clear. Thousands and thousands of American families were devastated by Madoff, by Stanford, MF Global, and the like. People lost their homes. People lost their cars. People lost their children's education funds. People lost their lifelong retirement savings. I could go on and on forever, but we have a limited amount of time. The job with the SEC is to protect those people. The job of the SEC is to protect honest people from dishonest corporations and persons. It's not to impose other agendas on the American public. It's not to talk about the environmental stewardship of corporations. If a corporation dealing with securities does not disclose a significant environmental risk, then they're going to be liable for that failure to disclose. But it's not the SEC's job to talk about their stewardship. SEC knew for a decade, a full 10 years, over 10 years, that Madoff was stealing from people. And they refused to take any action for over a decade. And over $70 billion evaporated. People's lives were devastated. People died. People died. There are dead people because of what Madoff did. And the SEC didn't lift a finger. They were too busy doing other things. Now here we intend to put SEC back on the job and focus on what they're supposed to do. Protect honest people from dishonest people. I reserve the balance of my time, if any.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
You know, when we had the SEC head before our committee, I made it very clear that I thought more could have been done, and I think it is with regard to Madoff, and I think it was extremely unfortunate that what happened. But again, that does not mean that we shouldn't provide clarity over all subjects which may affect investors, and that's what we're talking about here. I'm rely on my argument, but I'm going to also yield to my good friend, Mr. Frank from Massachusetts.
Yielding. The gentleman says the SEC wasn't on the Madoff thing for many years. That's true. And I have to say, while I supported the Bush administration on Sarbanes-Oxley, I am critical of their administration of the SEC. For almost all of that time, we had an SEC that was not inclined to enforce. And I do not think the current SEC, under a very good chairman, Mary Shapiro, with a much more vigorous approach, ought to be taxed for the failures that were ideologically driven by the previous SEC. So I don't think it is valid to say, well, because they didn't catch Madoff. The SEC, during the Bush administration, reflected an unfortunate philosophy of non-regulation, of ceding to the companies more autonomy than they should have, and it is not a good basis on which to legislate going forward. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
How much time do I have left?
1 minute.
I've endured about all I care to, and I think a large percentage of the people in this chamber and a lot of the people in this country have endured about all the finger-pointing and blame that they can endure. I don't care who shot John. I don't care who was in charge of the SEC before. The point of this bill is to keep the SEC focused on protecting investors.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman says...
Gentleman yields.
Reserve the balance of my time. Excuse me, I don't yield it.
Gentleman reserves.
I yield. How much time do I have, Madam?
1 minute.
I've reserved 30 seconds to the gentleman.
Well, first of all, a large percentage of the people in this room would be two. But secondly, The fact is that the gentleman from Florida is the one who started pointing fingers. When I talked about who's in charge of the SEC, all of a sudden he's above any criticism. But he's the one who impugned the SEC. He's the one who said the SEC sat and did nothing under Madoff. So if you're going to accuse the agency, then it becomes relevant as to who was running it. I didn't raise the issue of who was to blame and who was at fault. I was simply responding to my committee colleague from Florida. I thank the gentleman.
Gibson. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very poetic, but it's off point.
Okay.
The amendment wants SEC to focus on protecting honest people from dishonest corporations and people. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Yielding my time. How much time do I have, please?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Let me be clear. The SEC has a responsibility to disclose that information that investors need. And this is one of those areas we want to protect investors with everything we have. And I think this amendment flies in the face of that. And I would hope that the body would vote against the amendment.
Gentleman's time has
yield back.
expired. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the comments, and once again, I implore my colleagues to support this good amendment to keep the SEC on task. Their job is to protect investors from dishonest people and dishonest corporations. And with the passage of this amendment,
Gentleman's time
we
has
will do that.
expired.
Thank you.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to
Roll
Clause
call.
6.
Yeas and nays, please. Roll call.